The rifle scope's crosshairs trembled slightly as Sergeant Maya Chen adjusted her position on the rooftop, but not from nerves. The building beneath her was shaking from the artillery fire that had been pounding the city for 3 days straight. Through the scope, she could see enemy soldiers moving between the rubble-strewn streets like shadows, their movements coordinated and purposeful. They were preparing for something big. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Maya had been tracking their patterns for weeks, noting every detail in her worn leather notebook, while her fellow soldiers spent their downtime playing cards or writing letters home. She'd mapped their patrol routes, identified their communication methods, and documented their behavioral patterns with the precision of a scientist studying specimens. But when she'd tried to share her observations with her commanding officer, Captain Rodriguez had barely glanced at her reports. "Chen, you're overthinking this," he'd said, tossing her meticulously prepared intelligence briefings onto a stack of unread paperwork. "We've got drones and satellites for reconnaissance. We don't need you playing detective." The forward operating base in Kandahar province buzzed with activity as Maya Chen cleaned her rifle for the 3rd time that morning. The other soldiers in her unit were preparing for a routine patrol, checking equipment and reviewing standard protocols that had been drilled into them during training. Maya, however, sat apart from the group, her attention focused on a collection of photographs and hand-drawn maps spread across her bunk. For the past 6 months, Maya had been assigned to Bravo Company's reconnaissance unit, but her role had gradually shifted from active intelligence gathering to what Captain Rodriguez euphemistically called administrative support. In reality, she spent most of her time filing reports that no one read, organizing supply inventories, and watching from the sidelines as other soldiers carried out the missions she'd helped plan. The transition hadn't been sudden. It had started with small comments about her unconventional methods and tendency to overcomplicate simple operations. Maya's approach to intelligence work was different from her peers, where others relied on technology and standardized procedures. She preferred human observation and pattern analysis. She would spend hours studying enemy behavior, noting the subtle changes in their routines that might indicate an impending attack or reveal weaknesses in their defenses. "Chen's got too much imagination," she'd overheard Sergeant Williams telling another soldier. "She sees conspiracies everywhere. Makes her unreliable in the field." The accusation stung because it was so far from the truth. Maya's imagination wasn't the problem. Her precision was. She noticed details that others missed, remembered conversations that seemed insignificant at the time, and connected patterns that weren't immediately obvious. These skills had served her well during her first deployment in Iraq, where her intelligence work had helped prevent 3 separate ambushes. But that was under different leadership, with officers who valued thoroughness over speed. Captain Rodriguez ran his unit differently. He preferred quick decisions and rapid deployment, arguing that hesitation in combat zones got people killed. Maya's methodical approach to intelligence gathering didn't fit his operational philosophy, and over time, she'd found herself excluded from briefings and relegated to increasingly mundane tasks. The morning sun cast long shadows across the base as Maya reviewed her latest observations. She'd been tracking a group of insurgents who operated in the mountains north of their position, and their behavior had changed significantly over the past week. Their patrol patterns had become more erratic, their communication methods had shifted to older, harder-to-intercept radio frequencies, and they'd been moving supplies at unusual hours. Most concerning was the increase in their numbers. Maya had counted at least 40 fighters in the area, nearly double their usual strength. The influx of personnel suggested they were planning something significant, but when she'd mentioned this to Captain Rodriguez, he dismissed her concerns as speculation. "We've got satellite imagery showing normal activity levels," he'd said, without looking up from his morning briefing materials. Your ground observations are interesting, Chen, but they don't override hard intelligence from command. Maya had wanted to argue that her ground observations were based on 3 weeks of careful surveillance, but she'd learned to keep her objections to herself. Speaking up only reinforced the perception that she was difficult to work with. A soldier who couldn't accept that others might have better information or judgment. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd joined the military specifically for intelligence work, drawn by the challenge of piecing together complex puzzles that could save lives. Her test scores had been exceptional, her training evaluations stellar, and her early performance reviews had praised her analytical abilities and attention to detail. But somewhere along the way, those same qualities had become liabilities in the eyes of her superiors. Private Johnson approached Maya's bunk, his expression apologetic. Chen, Captain wants to see you in his office. Maya nodded and gathered her materials, knowing what the meeting would entail. Rodriguez had been assigning her to increasingly routine tasks, and she expected this would be another supply inventory or equipment maintenance assignment. As she walked across the base, she noticed the increased activity around the communications tent and the unusual number of vehicles being prepared for deployment. Something was happening, but she wasn't included in whatever planning was taking place. Captain Rodriguez's office was a study in organized chaos. Maps covered every available wall surface, marked with colored pins and overlaid with transparent sheets showing troop movements and supply routes. His desk was stacked with intelligence reports, operational orders, and communication transcripts. It was exactly the kind of environment where Maya's analytical skills would be most valuable. But she hadn't been inside the office for weeks. Chen, I've got a special assignment for you, Rodriguez said, without looking up from the document he was reading. We're expecting a supply convoy tomorrow, and I need someone to coordinate the inventory and distribution. It's important work, and I'm trusting you to handle it properly. Maya felt her stomach sink. Another logistics assignment. Another day spent counting boxes and filling out forms, while her fellow soldiers carried out actual intelligence work. She'd spent years training for reconnaissance and analysis, but here she was being assigned tasks that any competent clerk could handle. Sir, I've been monitoring increased insurgent activity in the northern sector, she said, knowing she was probably overstepping but unable to remain silent. Their pattern suggests they're preparing for a major operation. I think we should consider adjusting our patrol schedules and defensive positions. Rodriguez finally looked up from his papers, his expression showing familiar irritation. Chen, we've been over this. You're not assigned to active reconnaissance anymore. Your job is to support operations, not to second-guess intelligence from higher command. But sir, I've been tracking these fighters for weeks. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They've doubled their numbers and changed their operational patterns. That's not speculation. It's documented observation. Documented observation. Rodriguez repeated the phrase with obvious skepticism. Chen, you're a good soldier, but you have a tendency to see threats that don't exist. Command has better intelligence resources than one person with binoculars and a notebook. Maya felt the familiar frustration rising in her chest. She'd heard variations of this conversation dozens of times over the past months. Her observations were dismissed as paranoia, her detailed reports labeled as overthinking, and her concerns about enemy activity were characterized as an overactive imagination. I understand your concerns, sir, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. But I'd like to submit a formal intelligence brief about the northern sector activity. If I'm wrong, it won't matter. But if I'm right, we need to be prepared. Rodriguez leaned back in his chair, studying Maya with an expression she couldn't quite read. For a moment, she thought he might actually consider her request. Then he shook his head and returned his attention to his paperwork. Chen, you're not assigned to intelligence analysis anymore. Your job is logistics support. I need you to focus on the supply convoy tomorrow and stop worrying about operations that are above your pay grade. The dismissal was final, but Maya couldn't let it go. Sir, what if I'm right? What if they are planning something, and we're not prepared? Then we'll deal with it when it happens, Rodriguez said without looking up. Now, do you understand your assignment for tomorrow? Maya nodded, though she wanted to argue further. She'd learned that pushing too hard only made things worse, only reinforced the perception that she was difficult and unreliable. Yes, sir. I understand. As she left the office, Maya felt the weight of frustration and helplessness that had become her constant companion. She'd joined the military to make a difference, to use her skills in service of something larger than herself. Instead, she found herself marginalized and ignored, her expertise dismissed as paranoia. The rest of the day passed in a blur of routine activities. Maya organized supply requests, updated inventory logs, and coordinated with the mess hall about meal planning for the expected convoy personnel. It was competent work, but it felt like a waste of her training and abilities. Every time she heard radio chatter about patrol activities or intelligence briefings, she felt a pang of exclusion. As evening approached, Maya returned to her bunk and spread out her maps and photographs once more. Even if Rodriguez wouldn't listen to her concerns, she couldn't stop herself from analyzing the information she'd gathered. The patterns were too clear, the changes in enemy behavior too significant to ignore. She documented everything meticulously. Radio intercepts that showed increased chatter about the American position. Photographic evidence of supply movements that suggested the insurgents were stockpiling weapons and ammunition. Behavioral observations that indicated they were conducting reconnaissance of the base's defensive positions. Most troubling were the reports from local civilians who'd fled. The northern mountains, speaking of many fighters gathering in the area. Maya had interviewed several of these refugees during her off-duty hours, and their accounts were consistent. A large group of armed men had arrived in the region, and they were asking questions about American patrol schedules and defensive capabilities. Maya opened her notebook and began writing her own intelligence brief, even though she knew Rodriguez would never read it. She documented every observation, every pattern, every indication that suggested an attack was imminent. If she was wrong, the report would be meaningless. But if she was right, at least there would be a record of her warnings. As she worked, she could hear other soldiers discussing their plans for the evening. Some were playing poker in the recreation tent, others were video calling family members back home. The normalcy of their conversations felt surreal given her growing certainty that they were all in danger. Maya had learned to trust her instincts about enemy behavior. During her deployment in Iraq, she developed an almost intuitive sense for when something was wrong, when the patterns of normal activity shifted in ways that suggested impending violence. She felt that same sensation now, a nagging certainty that the quiet evening was deceptive. She finished writing her intelligence brief and placed it in her personal files. Tomorrow she would try once more to convince Rodriguez to take her warnings seriously. If he refused, she would have to decide whether to take the matter to a higher authority, knowing that going over her commanding officer's head would probably end her military career. But as Maya lay in her bunk that night, listening to the distant sounds of the base settling into its evening routine, she couldn't shake the feeling that careers and protocols might soon become irrelevant. The enemy was coming, and they weren't prepared. She'd spent months being told she was paranoid, unreliable, and prone to seeing threats that didn't exist. Tomorrow, she might finally have the chance to prove whether those assessments were accurate, or whether her supposedly overactive imagination had been trying to save all their lives. The last thing Maya heard before falling asleep was the distant sound of helicopters, their rotors cutting through the night air as they carried out reconnaissance missions in sectors that didn't include the northern mountains. She'd requested surveillance of that area weeks ago, but the request had been denied as unnecessary. As she drifted off to sleep, Maya wondered if she'd wake up to vindication or disaster. Either way, she'd be ready. The explosion started at 0347 hours, shattering the pre-dawn quiet with a violence that sent Maya tumbling from her bunk onto the concrete floor. The first blast was followed immediately by 3 more, each one closer than the last, and she could hear the distinctive whistle of incoming mortar cutting through the air above the base. Maya rolled under her bunk as debris rained down from the ceiling, her training taking over even as her mind struggled to process what was happening. The insurgents weren't supposed to have mortar. Intelligence reports had consistently indicated they possessed only small arms and improvised explosive devices. The coordinated nature of the attack, the precision of the targeting, the sheer volume of incoming fire, none of it matched the threat assessments she'd seen in official briefings. But it matched perfectly with the patterns she'd been tracking for weeks. Emergency sirens began wailing throughout the base as soldiers scrambled from their quarters, some still pulling on boots and grabbing weapons. Maya could hear Captain Rodriguez's voice over the communication system, shouting orders that were barely audible over the continuing explosions. The attack was coming from multiple directions simultaneously, suggesting a level of coordination that should have been impossible for the small disorganized group that official intelligence had described. Maya grabbed her rifle and tactical gear, moving with practiced efficiency despite the chaos around her. As she ran toward her assigned defensive position, she caught glimpses of the battle unfolding around the base perimeter. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness from at least 6 different locations, indicating the attackers had positioned themselves in a coordinated ring around the facility. This wasn't a random assault or opportunistic raid. This was a carefully planned military operation executed by a substantial force. The communication tent had taken a direct hit in the first wave of mortar, and smoke was pouring from its collapsed roof. Maya realized with growing dread that their primary means of calling for reinforcements or air support had been eliminated in the opening seconds of the attack. The insurgents hadn't just known where to hit, they'd known what to hit first. She reached her assigned position along the eastern perimeter, where Sergeant Williams was already directing defensive fire toward a group of attackers advancing through the rocky terrain beyond the fence line. The sergeant glanced at her with obvious relief, apparently grateful for any additional firepower. "Chen, take position at the northeast corner," Williams shouted over the gunfire. "We've got at least 20 hostiles approaching from that direction, and I need someone with good eyes to spot for our marksmen." Maya sprinted to the designated position, dropping prone behind a concrete barrier that provided cover while giving her a clear view of the approaching enemy forces. Through her rifle scope, she could see the attackers moving with military precision, using cover and concealment techniques that spoke of professional training rather than guerrilla improvisation. She began calling out targets to the other soldiers, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. Multiple contacts at 2 o'clock, approximately 300 meters, moving between the large rocks. 4 hostiles at 11 o'clock, using the dry riverbed for concealment. Her target identification was precise and valuable, but Maya quickly realized they were facing a much larger force than anyone had anticipated. Every time they suppressed one group of attackers, another group would emerge from a different direction. The insurgents were using classic infantry tactics, coordinated fire and movement that required extensive planning and training. More troubling was their obvious knowledge of the base's defensive positions. They were avoiding the areas where American forces were strongest and concentrating their attacks on weak points that weren't widely known outside the command structure. Either they had conducted extensive reconnaissance, or they had inside information about the base's vulnerabilities. Maya's radio crackled with fragmented communications as various units tried to coordinate their response. The damage to the primary, Communication center meant that different sections of the base were operating with limited awareness of the overall tactical situation. She could hear Captain Rodriguez trying to establish command and control, but his orders were reaching only some of the defensive positions. All units, this is Bravo 6. Rodriguez's voice came through the static. We're dealing with approximately 30 to 40 hostiles conducting a coordinated assault. Hold your positions and maintain defensive fire. Air support is en route. Maya felt a chill run down her spine. Rodriguez was still operating under the assumption that they faced a standard insurgent force of moderate size. Through her scope, she'd already counted more than 60 individual attackers, and new groups were still emerging from concealed positions in the surrounding terrain. The enemy force was at least twice as large as command believed, and their coordination suggested extensive planning and professional leadership. She keyed her radio, knowing she was probably overstepping protocol, but unable to remain silent. Bravo 6, this is Chen. I'm observing significantly more hostiles than reported. Count appears to be over 60 fighters with coordinated movement. Patterns. This is not a standard insurgent assault. There was a pause before Rodriguez responded, his voice tight with stress and irritation. Chen, maintain radio discipline and focus on your assigned sector. We have situational awareness from multiple sources. Maya wanted to argue, to explain that her position gave her a better view of the overall enemy disposition than any single command post could provide, but incoming fire forced her to focus on immediate threats. A group of attackers had gotten within 100 meters of the perimeter fence and were preparing to breach the wire obstacles. She shifted her aim to the closest target, a figure in dark clothing who was cutting through the fence with wire cutters. The shot was clean, dropping the attacker instantly, but 3 more immediately took his place. Maya worked her bolt action smoothly, acquiring and engaging targets with the precision that had made her one of the unit's best marksmen during training exercises. But for every attacker she eliminated, 2 more seemed to appear. The enemy force was larger and better organized than anything they'd prepared for, and the defensive plan that had seemed adequate against a typical insurgent raid was proving insufficient against this coordinated assault. The sound of explosions intensified as the attackers began using rocket-propelled grenades against the base's hardened positions. Maya could see the launcher's signatures through her scope, bright flashes that revealed positions she immediately called out to other defenders. The insurgents were using military-grade weapons and tactics that suggested extensive external support. As the battle continued, Maya began to notice patterns in the enemy's movements that troubled her even more than their numbers and equipment. They were using hand signals and movement techniques that indicated formal military training. Their fire discipline was excellent, with covering fire and tactical bounds that spoke of professional instruction. This wasn't a ragtag group of local fighters, this was a trained military unit operating under competent leadership. The realization struck her with sudden clarity. The patterns she'd been tracking for weeks weren't just indicators of increased insurgent activity. They were signs of a professional military force conducting reconnaissance and preparing for a key-for major operation. The changed communication methods, the influx of personnel, the behavioral modifications she'd documented, they all made sense when viewed as preparation for this coordinated assault. Maya had been right about the threat, but she'd been wrong about its nature. This wasn't just a large insurgent raid. This was a military operation designed to overrun and destroy the entire base. She keyed her radio again, knowing she was probably ending her military career, but unable to watch her fellow soldiers die for lack of accurate intelligence. All stations, this is Chen. Enemy force consists of at least 80 trained fighters using military tactics and equipment. This is not an insurgent raid. This is a coordinated military assault designed to overrun our position. The radio response was immediate and angry. Chen, get off the net and maintain fire discipline. Rodriguez's voice snapped through the static. You're not in a position to assess the overall tactical situation. But Maya could see what others couldn't from her elevated position at the northeast corner. The enemy wasn't just attacking randomly, they were executing a coordinated plan to breach the perimeter in multiple locations simultaneously. Once they achieved penetration, they would be able to attack the base's critical facilities from inside. The defensive perimeter. She watched in growing horror as groups of attackers approached weak points in the fence line that weren't adequately defended. The official defensive plan had been based on intelligence estimates that dramatically underestimated both the size and capability of the attacking force. The positions and tactics that might have worked against 30 insurgents with small arms were proving inadequate against 80 fighters with military training and heavy weapons. Maya made a decision that would either save lives or end her career. She abandoned her assigned position and began moving toward the areas where enemy penetration seemed most likely. If she couldn't convince command to adjust their response, she would have to take action on her own initiative. As she moved through the base, Maya could see the full extent of the assault unfolding around her. The insurgents had indeed conducted extensive reconnaissance because they were attacking precisely those locations where the defensive fire was weakest. They'd identified blind spots in the surveillance system, gaps in the perimeter defense, and weaknesses in the communication network. Everything she'd been trying to warn about for weeks was happening exactly as she'd feared. The enemy had studied their target, prepared extensively, and launched a coordinated assault designed to exploit specific vulnerabilities. The only reason the base hadn't already fallen was the courage and training of individual soldiers who were fighting harder than anyone had expected them to need to. Maya reached the southern perimeter just as a group of attackers breached the fence line. The assigned defenders had been suppressed by heavy fire from concealed positions, and the enemy fighters were pouring through the gap in small groups. Within minutes, they would be inside the base's defensive perimeter with access to critical facilities. She dropped prone behind a concrete barrier and began engaging the attackers as they came through the breach. Her first shot dropped the lead fighter, causing the others to dive for cover among the buildings and equipment scattered near the perimeter. Maya worked her rifle methodically, using the marksmanship skills that had been dismissed as less important than computer-based intelligence analysis. But she was one soldier against a dozen attackers, and she couldn't hold the position alone. She keyed her radio, hoping someone would listen to her tactical assessment. Southern perimeter is compromised. I count 12 hostiles inside the wire, moving toward the fuel depot and generator facility. The response came not from Rodriguez but from Sergeant Williams, whose voice carried grudging respect. Chen, can you maintain observation on those targets? We're trying to get a response team to your location. Maya adjusted her position to get a better view of the infiltrating attackers while maintaining cover from their return fire. Through her scope, she could see them moving with obvious knowledge of the base layout, heading directly toward the most critical infrastructure targets. Their movement wasn't random or opportunistic. They knew exactly where they needed to go to cause maximum damage. The fuel depot was their obvious primary target. If they could destroy the base's fuel supplies, it would eliminate any possibility of vehicular patrols or helicopter operations. The generator facility was equally critical, providing power for communication equipment, surveillance systems, and defensive lighting. Losing both targets would leave the base virtually defenseless against continued assault. Maya began engaging the infiltrators systematically, using her superior knowledge of the base layout to predict their movement patterns. She'd spent months walking every inch of the facility during her logistics assignments, learning the locations of every building, every piece of equipment, every potential cover position. That knowledge, combined with her marksmanship skills, allowed her to engage targets that other defenders couldn't see or reach. Her radio crackled with communications from across the base as the battle intensified. Multiple groups of attackers had breached the perimeter in different locations, and the defenders were struggling to maintain coordinated resistance. The damage to the primary communication center was limiting command and control capabilities. Just when they were most needed, Maya realized with growing clarity that the official response plan wasn't working. The defensive strategy had been based on intelligence assessments that were completely wrong about the enemy's size, capabilities, and intentions. Unless someone adapted to the actual tactical situation, the base would fall within the next hour. She made another decision that violated every protocol she'd been taught about military hierarchy and chain of command. She began using her radio to coordinate defensive actions based on her observations of enemy movements. It was a role that should have been filled by officers with authority and access to overall intelligence, but those officers were operating with information that didn't match the reality unfolding around them. "Western perimeter. This is Chen," she transmitted, watching a group of attackers attempting to flank the main defensive positions. "You have 8 hostiles moving through the vehicle park toward your blind side. Recommend shifting 2 defenders." To cover the approach, the response was immediate. "Chen, what's your authority for tactical coordination?" The voice belonged to Lieutenant Morrison, one of the junior officers she'd worked with during better times. Maya took a breath, knowing her next words would either help save the base or end her military career permanently. "Sir, I don't have authority, but I have clear observation of enemy movements that command isn't seeing. We can discuss protocols after we survive the next hour." There was a pause, then Morrison's voice came back with grudging acceptance. "Copy that, Chen. What do you see?" For the next 30 minutes, Maya became an unofficial coordinator for defensive actions across the base. Her elevated position and detailed knowledge of the facility layout gave her a better tactical picture than anyone else had access to. She called out target locations, warned of flanking movements, and directed defensive fire toward the most critical threats. The other soldiers began to listen to her assessments because they were consistently accurate and tactically valuable. When she warned of an attack on the medical facility, defenders were already in position when the enemy arrived. When she identified a group preparing to assault the ammunition depot, suppressive fire drove them back before they could reach their target. But Maya could see that they were still losing the battle. Despite her warnings and coordination efforts, the enemy force was simply too large and too well organized for the base's defensive capabilities. They were maintaining pressure on multiple fronts while systematically targeting critical infrastructure. Unless something changed dramatically, the position would become untenable within the hour. That was when Maya noticed something that made her blood run cold. Through her scope, she could see a new group of attackers moving into position on the high ground north of the base. They were carrying equipment that looked like heavy weapons, possibly mortar or rocket launchers capable of devastating the remaining defensive positions. If that group reached their intended firing position, they would be able to deliver precision fire on any target within the base. The remaining defenders would be unable to maintain their positions under that kind of concentrated bombardment, and organized resistance would collapse within minutes. Maya keyed her radio one more time, knowing this might be the most important transmission of her life. "All stations, this is Chen. Heavy weapons team moving to elevated position north of base. If they reach that location, we lose the ability to maintain defensive positions. Someone needs to stop them before they get set up." Captain Rodriguez's voice came back immediately, sharp with stress and exhaustion. "Chen, we don't have any units available for offensive operations. Everyone is committed to defensive positions." Maya looked through her scope at the heavy weapons team methodically climbing toward their firing position. They were perhaps 10 minutes away from being able to rain destruction down on the entire base. Once they opened fire, the battle would be over in less than 30 minutes. She made her final decision, knowing it would change everything that came after. "Bravo 6, this is Chen. I'm moving to intercept the heavy weapons team. I can reach them before they achieve firing position. The response was immediate and predictable. Negative, Chen. You're not authorized for independent action. Maintain your current position and continue observation duties. Maya was already moving, grabbing additional ammunition and checking her equipment as she prepared to leave the relative safety of her defensive position. Through her radio, she could hear Rodriguez repeating his order with increasing urgency, but she was beyond caring about protocol or career consequences. 80 soldiers and support personnel were depending on defensive positions that couldn't hold against heavy weapons fire. If she followed orders and stayed in place, they would all be dead or captured within the hour. If she acted on her own initiative, she might be able to prevent that outcome, even if it meant the end of her military career. Maya began moving toward the northern perimeter, using her knowledge of the base layout to avoid enemy observation, while heading toward the most dangerous mission of her life. Behind her, she could hear Rodriguez's voice on the radio, demanding that she return to her position immediately. But Maya was done being an observer. For months, she'd watched from the sidelines while others made decisions based on incomplete or incorrect information. Tonight, she would act on the intelligence she'd gathered and the tactical situation. She understood better than anyone else in the command structure. The heavy weapons team was still climbing toward their firing position, unaware that a single American soldier was moving to intercept them. Maya checked her rifle one more time and began the approach that would either save her unit or cost her everything she'd worked for in her military career. Either way, she would finally have the chance to prove whether her analysis and observations had been paranoia or the kind of intelligence work that saves lives when everything else fails. Part 3. The night everything changed, Maya moved through the darkness like a ghost, her boots finding purchase on the rocky terrain without making a sound. Years of training had taught her to move silently, but tonight felt different. Every step carried the weight of lives hanging in the balance, every breath measured against the ticking clock of the heavy weapons team, climbing toward their firing position. The base behind her was still under siege, muzzle flashes illuminating the perimeter in sporadic bursts of orange light. She could hear the ongoing firefight through her radio, defenders calling out target positions and ammunition requests, with voices growing increasingly strained. Rodriguez was still trying to coordinate the defense, but his orders carried the edge of a man realizing his intelligence assessments had been catastrophically wrong. Maya had memorized the terrain during countless patrol observations that others had dismissed as busy work. The northern approach to the base followed a natural ridge line that provided excellent cover for anyone trying to reach elevated firing positions. She'd noted the route in her reports months ago, identifying it as a potential security vulnerability that should be monitored. Those reports had been filed away with all her other overthinking analyses. Now she was grateful for every hour she'd spent studying the landscape, every notation she'd made about sightlines and approaches. The heavy weapons team was following the exact route she'd predicted, moving with confidence that suggested they'd scouted the area extensively. Their movements confirmed what she'd suspected for weeks. This assault had been planned down to the smallest detail. Through her night vision scope, Maya could see the team clearly now. 12 fighters carrying equipment that made her stomach clench with recognition. The mortar they were hauling weren't improvised weapons cobbled together from salvaged parts. These were military-grade tubes with professional sighting equipment, capable of devastating accuracy against fixed targets. In the right hands, they could eliminate every defensive position on the base within minutes. But Maya had advantages the enemy couldn't have anticipated. She knew the terrain better than they did, having studied every rock formation and gully. During her supposed busy work assignments, she understood their likely firing positions because she'd analyzed them during reconnaissance exercises that others had considered waste of time. Most importantly, she'd spent the last 6 months being consistently underestimated. which meant no one expected a single American soldier to attempt what she was about to do. The lead elements of the heavy weapons team were perhaps 8 minutes from reaching their optimal firing position. Maya calculated angles and distances with the precision of someone who'd spent countless hours studying ballistics and trajectory analysis. She would have one opportunity to disrupt their operation before they could set up their mortar and begin systematically destroying the base's defensive capabilities. Maya settled into a concealed position among a cluster of large rocks that provided cover while giving her clear sight lines to the enemy's approach route. The position had been noted in her reconnaissance reports as an excellent overwatch point, one of dozens of tactical observations that had been dismissed as irrelevant. Detail. Tonight, those details might be the difference between survival and catastrophe. She controlled her breathing, letting her heart rate settle as she prepared for what would either be the most important engagement of her military career or the last action she'd ever take. The enemy fighters were moving confidently, apparently convinced that their reconnaissance had identified all potential threats. They hadn't accounted for a single defender taking independent action, based on intelligence assessments that command had rejected. The first target presented itself as the heavy weapons team's point. Man crested a small rise 40 meters from Maya's position. Through her scope, she could see him clearly, a bearded fighter carrying an assault rifle and what appeared to be communication equipment. He was scanning the area with professional competence, but his attention was focused on potential threats from the base rather than the possibility of an American soldier positioned ahead of his advance. Maya's first shot was perfect, dropping the point man instantly. The suppressed rifle made minimal noise, but the target's sudden collapse would alert the rest of the team within seconds. She worked her bolt action smoothly, acquiring her next target before the enemy could react to the threat. The second fighter went down as he turned toward his fallen comrade, Maya's bullet taking him center mass before he could call out a warning. But the third member of the team was quicker, diving for cover while shouting alerts to the rest of the group. Maya's third shot caught him as he moved, spinning him around before he collapsed behind a boulder. Now the rest of the heavy weapons team knew they were under attack, but they couldn't see where the fire was coming from. Maya had chosen her position specifically to exploit this advantage, using the terrain to mask her muzzle signature while maintaining clear fields of fire on their likely approach routes. The enemy fighters began moving tactically, using cover and concealment as they tried to identify and suppress the threat. But Maya had studied their movement patterns for weeks, and she could predict where they would appear next. Her fourth shot caught a fighter as he attempted to bound between cover positions, the bullet finding its mark before he could reach safety. Maya shifted position slightly, moving to a secondary firing point she'd identified during her reconnaissance. The heavy weapons team was now fully alert and beginning to coordinate their response, but they were operating in terrain that Maya knew better than they did. Every rock formation, every gully, every potential cover position had been mapped and analyzed during her months of supposed busy work. Her fifth target appeared as the enemy team tried to flank her original position. Maya had anticipated this maneuver, positioning herself to cover the most likely approach routes. The shot was more difficult, requiring compensation for wind and elevation, but her bullet found its target as the fighter exposed himself while moving between positions. The remaining 7 members of the heavy weapons team were now trapped in a tactical nightmare. They were carrying heavy equipment that limited their mobility, operating in unfamiliar terrain, and facing an enemy who clearly understood the ground better than they did. Their mission required them to reach specific firing positions, but doing so meant exposing themselves to continued sniper fire from an unseen opponent. Maya heard their leader shouting orders in a language she didn't recognize, but the tactical meaning was clear. They were trying to coordinate suppressive fire while moving the mortar equipment toward their objective. The mission was still their priority, even with nearly half their team eliminated. This level of tactical discipline confirmed what Maya had suspected. These weren't local insurgents but professional soldiers with military training. The sixth target presented itself as the enemy team tried to rush their equipment toward the firing position. Maya's shot disrupted the movement, dropping one of the fighters carrying mortar components. The heavy tube fell among the rocks with a metallic clang that echoed across the hillside, temporarily blocking the team's advance route. But Maya could see that the remaining fighters were adapting to her tactics. They were using coordinated movement and covering fire, making her shots more difficult while continuing to advance toward their objective. She needed to change her approach before they reached the firing position and set up their mortar. Maya abandoned her concealed position and began moving aggressively, using her knowledge of the terrain to stay ahead of the enemy team while maintaining pressure on their advance. This was the kind of independent tactical thinking that had gotten her labeled as unreliable, but tonight it was the only approach that could prevent disaster. Her seventh shot came from a completely different angle, catching the enemy team by surprise as they focused on her previous position. The fighter went down hard, his weapon clattering against the rocks as he fell. Maya was already moving again, repositioning for her next engagement while the enemy tried to adjust to her new location. The tactical situation was evolving rapidly. The heavy weapons team had lost more than half their personnel, but the survivors were now close enough to their objective that they might be able to set up a reduced mortar capability. Even a single tube could devastate the base's defensive positions if it reached the optimal firing point. Maya's eighth shot disrupted another attempt to advance the mortar equipment, but she could see that time was running against her. The remaining 4 fighters were moving with desperate determination, apparently willing to accept casualties to complete their mission. Their tactical discipline remained impressive even under pressure, suggesting professional military training rather than insurgent improvisation. She shifted tactics again, moving to a position that would allow her to intercept the enemy team's most likely route to their firing position. The move required exposing herself to potential return fire, but Maya had run out of conservative options. If the mortar reached their destination, her individual actions would become irrelevant. The 9th target appeared as the team leader attempted to coordinate his remaining fighters' final push toward the objective. Maya's shot was clean, eliminating the enemy's command and control just as they reached the critical phase of their mission. The remaining 3 fighters hesitated, apparently uncertain how to proceed without leadership. Maya pressed her advantage, moving aggressively while the enemy team was disoriented. Her 10th shot caught one of the remaining fighters as he tried to drag mortar components toward the firing position. The heavy equipment scattered across the rocky ground, some pieces rolling down the hillside and disappearing into the darkness. 2 enemy fighters remained, but they were now trapped between Maya's position and the need to complete their mission. Without the mortar equipment, their presence on the hillside served no tactical purpose, but retreating would mean admitting failure and leaving their dead comrades behind. Maya could see them making the calculation between survival and mission completion. Her 11th shot made the decision for them, dropping one of the remaining fighters as he attempted to recover salvageable mortar components. The final enemy fighter found himself alone on a hillside littered with his team's casualties, facing an unseen American sniper who had systematically dismantled his unit's capability. Maya waited, watching through her scope as the last fighter made his choice. He could attempt to continue the mission alone, retreat back down the hillside, or try to locate and eliminate the threat that had destroyed his team. Each option carried significant risks, and Maya was prepared for any of them. The fighter chose retreat, abandoning the mortar equipment and beginning to move back down the hillside toward the base of the ridge. Maya tracked him through her scope, calculating the shot parameters for a moving target on steep terrain. The range was challenging, but well within her capabilities. Her 12th and final shot of the engagement dropped the retreating fighter before he could reach safety. The hillside fell silent except for the distant sounds of ongoing combat from the base below. Maya had eliminated the entire heavy weapons team and prevented them from reaching their firing position. But even as Maya confirmed that the immediate threat was neutralized, she could hear through her radio that the base was still under assault. The elimination of the heavy weapons team had prevented catastrophic bombardment, but the main enemy force was still pressing their attack against the perimeter defenses. The battle was far from over. Maya began moving back toward the base, carrying the captured mortar components that might provide valuable intelligence about the enemy's capabilities and support network. As she moved, she could hear Rodriguez's voice on the radio, coordinating defensive actions with increasing desperation. The base's ammunition supplies were running low, and several defensive positions had been abandoned due to casualties. The tactical situation was still critical, but Maya's action on the hillside had bought time and prevented the kind of devastating fire support that would have made continued resistance impossible. Now she needed to return to the base and contribute to the overall defense, using her remaining ammunition and tactical knowledge to help hold the perimeter until reinforcements could arrive. As she approached the northern edge of the base, Maya could see that the enemy's assault had evolved since she'd left to intercept the heavy weapons team. Several buildings were burning, casting orange light across the compound and eliminating the night vision advantages that had helped the defenders initially. Smoke from the fires was reducing visibility and making target identification more difficult. Maya keyed her radio, knowing that her unauthorized absence would have to be explained eventually. Bravo 6, this is Chen returning to friendly lines. Heavy weapons threat has been neutralized. Rodriguez's response was immediate and sharp. Chen, where the hell have you been? I ordered you to maintain your observation position. Sir, I eliminated a 12-man heavy weapons team that was preparing to mortar the base from elevated positions. The threat has been removed. There was a pause, then Rodriguez's voice came back with obvious skepticism. Chen, confirm your last transmission. You're claiming you engaged a 12-man enemy team by yourself. Maya was already moving toward a defensive position where she could contribute to the ongoing firefight. Confirmed, sir. Heavy weapons team eliminated. Mortar equipment captured. I move in to reinforce the eastern perimeter. She could hear other voices in the background of Rodriguez's transmission, apparently discussing her report with disbelief. But Maya didn't have time to provide detailed explanations. Through her scope, she could see that enemy fighters had penetrated the base perimeter in several locations and were moving among the buildings with obvious knowledge of the facility layout. Maya settled into a firing position that gave her clear sight lines across the interior of the base. The smoke and firelight created challenging visibility conditions, but her knowledge of the facility layout allowed her to predict where enemy fighters would appear. Her first shot after returning to the base dropped an attacker who was moving toward the ammunition depot with what appeared to be explosive charges. The engagement that followed was unlike anything Maya had experienced during her military training. The enemy fighters were operating inside the base perimeter with detailed knowledge of building locations and defensive vulnerabilities. They moved with purpose and coordination, targeting critical infrastructure while avoiding areas where American defenders were strongest. Maya's shots were carefully chosen, each one designed to disrupt specific enemy objectives rather than simply inflicting casualties. When she saw fighters approaching the fuel depot, she eliminated them before they could place charges. When enemy teams tried to flank defensive positions, she provided covering fire that allowed American defenders to reposition safely. Her 13th through 16th eliminations came during a coordinated enemy assault on the base's primary generator facility. 4 fighters had approached the building using a route that avoided most defensive positions, but Maya's elevated position allowed her to engage them as they prepared to plant explosive devices. Each shot was precisely placed, preventing the destruction of critical power infrastructure. The 17th and 18th eliminations occurred when enemy fighters attempted to overrun the medical facility where wounded American personnel were receiving treatment. Maya's intervention allowed the medical staff to evacuate their patients to a more secure location while maintaining treatment capabilities for additional casualties. But Maya could see that the overall tactical situation remained precarious. Despite her individual successes, the enemy force was large enough to maintain pressure on multiple fronts simultaneously. American ammunition was running low, several defensive positions had been compromised, and communication with higher command remained sporadic due to damaged equipment. Her 19th elimination came as enemy fighters prepared to assault the base's small armory, where the remaining ammunition and explosive ordnance were stored. If the enemy captured or destroyed those supplies, continued resistance would become impossible within minutes. Maya's shot disrupted the assault just as the attackers reached the building's entrance. The 20th and final elimination of the night occurred as Maya spotted an enemy fighter preparing to fire a rocket-propelled grenade at the remaining communication antenna. The shot was difficult, requiring compensation for wind, smoke, and the target's movement, but Maya's bullet found its mark just as the fighter was preparing to pull the trigger. As dawn began to break over the base, the surviving enemy fighters began withdrawing toward the surrounding hills. Their assault had failed to achieve its primary objectives, largely due to Maya's interventions at critical moments. The heavy weapons support they'd counted on had been eliminated before it could be employed. Their attempts to destroy critical infrastructure had been disrupted, and their casualty rate had been higher than anticipated. Maya remained in her firing position, watching through her scope as the last enemy fighters disappeared into the rocky terrain beyond the base perimeter. Her ammunition was nearly exhausted, her throat was dry from smoke and exertion, and her hands were beginning to shake from adrenaline depletion. But the base was still in American hands, and most of her fellow soldiers had survived the night. The radio crackled with transmissions as unit leaders began assessing damage and casualties. Several buildings had been destroyed or damaged equipment had been lost, and there were wounded personnel requiring medical evacuation. But the base's defensive capability remained intact, and critical infrastructure had been preserved despite the coordinated assault. Captain Rodriguez's voice came through the static, his tone notably different from the dismissive authority he displayed throughout Maya's deployment. "All stations, this is Bravo 6. Enemy forces are withdrawing from the area. Maintain defensive positions and prepare for possible follow-up attacks." Maya keyed her radio, knowing that her actions during the night would require extensive explanation and probably formal investigation. "Bravo 6, this is Chen. Enemy withdrawal confirmed from my position. No immediate threats visible in northern sector." This time, Rodriguez's response carried a note of something Maya hadn't heard before: respect. "Chen, report to command post for debriefing. Bring any captured equipment or intelligence materials." As Maya began moving toward the command post, she encountered other soldiers who looked at her with expressions ranging from amazement to disbelief. Word had apparently spread through the base about her individual actions during the night, though the details were probably garbled through multiple retellings. Sergeant Williams approached her as she walked across the compound, his expression showing the kind of respect she'd never seen from him before. "Chen, is it true you took out that whole mortar team by yourself?" Maya nodded, too exhausted for detailed explanations. The threat was eliminated before they could reach firing position. Williams studied her face, apparently looking for signs of exaggeration or bravado. What he saw must have convinced him, because his expression shifted to something approaching awe. "Jesus, Chen, how many did you get altogether?" 20 confirmed eliminations, Maya replied simply. 12 in the heavy weapons team, 8 during base defense operations. The number seemed to resonate through the group of soldiers who had gathered around them. 20 enemy fighters eliminated by a single soldier during one night's engagement was the kind of achievement that would become legend in military circles. But Maya felt no particular pride in the accomplishment. She'd done what was necessary to protect her unit and prevent mission failure. Captain Rodriguez was waiting for her at the command post, his expression showing a mixture of exhaustion, relief, and something that might have been embarrassment. The tactical map spread across his desk showed the extent of the night's engagement. Enemy approach routes, penetration points, defensive positions, and casualty locations. It was a complex battle that had required coordinated response at multiple levels. "Chen, I need a complete after-action report on your activities during the night," Rodriguez said without preamble. "Start with your decision to abandon your assigned position and work through each engagement chronologically." Maya provided a detailed account of her actions, from the initial decision to intercept the heavy weapons team, through each subsequent engagement during the base defense. She described her tactical reasoning, target selection criteria, and assessment of enemy capabilities based on their equipment and movement patterns. Rodriguez listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on his tactical map as Maya described specific locations and timing. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and studied her with an expression she couldn't interpret. "Chen, your actions during this engagement prevented catastrophic damage to base infrastructure and probably saved dozens of American lives," he said finally. "They also represented multiple violations of direct orders and unauthorized independent action." Maya had expected this moment since making her first decision to disobey orders. "Yes, sir. I accept full responsibility for my actions and any disciplinary consequences." Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, apparently weighing competing considerations. Finally, he spoke with obvious reluctance. "Chen, I'm recommending you for the Distinguished Service Cross for exceptional heroism in combat operations. I'm also noting in your file that you demonstrated tactical judgment that proved superior to command assessments." Maya felt something shift in her chest, an emotion she couldn't immediately identify. After months of being dismissed and marginalized, her tactical judgment was finally being acknowledged as valuable rather than problematic. "Sir, I was just doing my job as I understood it," she replied. "No, Chen. You were doing your job as you should have been allowed to do it all along." Rodriguez's admission carried the weight of recognition that his leadership decisions had been flawed. "Your intelligence assessments about enemy activity were correct. Your tactical recommendations should have been implemented. I let personal biases interfere with operational effectiveness." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Colonel Martinez, the base commander who had been attending a conference during the night's engagement. His helicopter had landed just after dawn, and he'd been briefed on the tactical situation while en route to the command post. "Captain Rodriguez, I need a complete situation report," Martinez said as he entered the command post, his eyes fixed on Maya with obvious interest. "And I understand Sergeant Chen played a significant role in last night's defense." Rodriguez provided a comprehensive briefing on the enemy assault, defensive response, and outcome. He described Maya's actions with professional accuracy, noting both her tactical successes and her violations of direct orders. When he finished, Martinez turned his attention to Maya directly. "Sergeant Chen, your individual performance during this engagement is being reviewed at division level," Martinez said. 20 confirmed eliminations during a single night's combat operations represents extraordinary achievement under any circumstances. Maya remained at attention, uncertain how to respond to praise from such a senior officer. Throughout her deployment, she'd rarely interacted with anyone above company level, and never under circumstances where her individual actions were the focus of attention. "Sir, I was following my assessment of the tactical situation and acting to protect American personnel," she replied. Martinez nodded approvingly. That kind of tactical initiative is exactly what we need from our non-commissioned officers. Captain Rodriguez has recommended you for the Distinguished Service Cross, and I'm endorsing that recommendation." But Maya could see that Martinez had more to say. The colonel studied her personnel file, which had apparently been retrieved, for his review before continuing with obvious purpose. "Chen, your background shows consistent excellence in intelligence analysis and tactical assessment. Your performance evaluations from previous deployments were outstanding. Why hasn't this potential been utilized more effectively during your current assignment?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, and Maya could see Rodriguez shifting uncomfortably. The colonel was clearly aware that Maya's capabilities had been underutilized, and he wanted explanations. "Sir, Sergeant Chen had been assigned to logistics support duties due to concerns about her analytical approach to intelligence work," Rodriguez said carefully. "There were questions about her tendency to see patterns that weren't confirmed by other intelligence sources." Martinez's expression showed obvious skepticism. "Captain, last night's engagement suggests that Sergeant Chen's pattern recognition was more accurate than your other intelligence sources. Would you agree with that assessment?" Rodriguez had no choice but to acknowledge the obvious truth. "Yes, sir. Sergeant Chen's warnings about increased enemy activity proved correct. Her tactical assessments were more accurate than official intelligence estimates." The colonel closed Maya's personnel file and looked directly at her. "Chen, how would you like to be transferred to division intelligence staff? We need analysts who can see patterns that others miss, and last night demonstrates you have that capability." Maya felt her breath catch. Assignment to division intelligence would represent everything she'd hoped for when joining the military. The opportunity to use her analytical skills in service of something larger than herself, recognition for the capabilities she'd developed, and the chance to make a meaningful contribution to mission success. "Sir, I would be honored to serve wherever I can be most effective," she replied. Martinez nodded with satisfaction. "Consider it done. You'll be transferred within the week." He turned back to Rodriguez with an expression that suggested the captain's leadership decisions would be receiving additional scrutiny. "Captain, I'll expect a complete review of personnel utilization practices within your command." As the colonel left the command post, Maya found herself alone with Rodriguez for what might be their final official interaction. The captain looked exhausted and somewhat defeated, clearly aware that his judgment and leadership had been found wanting. "Chen, I owe you an apology," he said finally. "I let my preconceptions about your analytical style cloud my judgment about your capabilities. Last night proved that your approach to intelligence work was exactly what we needed." Maya considered her response carefully. Rodriguez had made decisions that could have cost lives, but he was also acknowledging his mistakes and showing genuine remorse. Military leadership required the ability to admit errors and learn from them. "Sir, we all make decisions based on the information available at the time," she replied diplomatically. "The important thing is that we learn from the experience and adapt our approach accordingly." Rodriguez nodded, apparently grateful for her measured response. "Your performance last night will be remembered throughout this command. You've set a standard for individual initiative and tactical excellence that others will try to match." As Maya left the command post, she reflected on how completely her situation had changed in the span of a single night. 24 hours. Earlier, she'd been a marginalized soldier whose expertise was dismissed and whose contributions were undervalued. Now she was being decorated for heroism and promoted to a position where her analytical skills would be recognized and utilized. But the most important change wasn't in her career prospects or official recognition. Maya had finally proven to herself that her instincts and analytical abilities were valuable, that her careful preparation and attention to detail could make the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The base around her showed the scars of the night's engagement: damaged buildings, destroyed equipment, and the kind of organized chaos that follows intense combat operations. But it was still an American base, still functional, still capable of supporting continued operations in the region. Maya's individual actions had contributed to that outcome in ways that would probably never be fully documented or understood. Over the following days, as the base was repaired and reinforced, Maya prepared for her transfer to Division Intelligence. The soldiers who had survived the night's engagement treated her differently now, with the kind of respect reserved for those who had proven themselves under the most demanding circumstances. The 20 enemy fighters she'd eliminated during the engagement had been part of a coordinated assault designed to destroy American capabilities in the region. Their failure meant that other operations could continue, that other soldiers would have the support and protection they needed to complete their missions. Maya's tactical decisions during those critical hours had ripple effects that extended far beyond the immediate battle. When Maya's transfer orders came through, she was assigned to a position specifically created to utilize her pattern recognition and analytical capabilities. Division Intelligence wanted someone who could see connections that others missed, who could identify threats before they materialized, and who could provide tactical assessments based on comprehensive observation rather than technological detection alone. As she prepared to leave the base, Maya visited the memorial that had been erected for the soldiers killed during the assault. 3 American personnel had died during the engagement, and several others had been wounded seriously enough to require medical evacuation. The casualties were tragic, but they would have been far worse if the enemy's heavy weapons had reached their firing positions. Maya understood that her actions had saved lives, but she also knew that the price of combat operations was always measured in human terms. The 20 enemy fighters she'd eliminated had families, communities, and personal stories that would never be fully known. War required such calculations, but it never made them easy to accept. Standing before the memorial, Maya made a quiet promise to continue developing her skills and serving with the same dedication that had characterized her approach throughout the deployment. The recognition she'd received was gratifying, but the real measure of her success would be her ability to prevent future attacks through better intelligence analysis and threat assessment. Her final act before leaving the base was to complete a comprehensive intelligence report documenting everything she'd observed about enemy capabilities, tactics, and operational patterns. The report would become part of the institutional knowledge that might help other soldiers recognize and respond to similar threats. As Maya's transport helicopter lifted off from the base, she looked down at the facility that had been her home for the past deployment. The buildings looked small from altitude, insignificant against the vast landscape of mountains and desert that stretched to the horizon. But Maya knew that some of the most important battles were fought in small places by individuals who simply refused to accept defeat. She'd been called a liability, dismissed as paranoid, and marginalized for seeing patterns that others couldn't recognize. But when the crisis came, when lives hung in the balance and systems failed, her supposed weaknesses had become the strengths that saved her unit from catastrophe. The helicopter carried Maya toward her new assignment, where her analytical abilities would be valued rather than dismissed, where her attention to detail would be seen as an asset rather than a problem. But more importantly, she carried with her the knowledge that preparation, dedication, and the courage to act when others hesitate could make the difference between success and failure when it mattered most. Sometimes the most important battles aren't won by the biggest forces or the most advanced technology. Sometimes they're won by individuals who see what others miss, who prepare for scenarios that others ignore, and who step forward when the lights go out and the systems fail. Maya Chen had become one of those individuals, and her story would inspire others to develop the same combination of analytical precision and tactical courage. The base grew smaller in the distance until it disappeared entirely, but its lessons would remain with Maya throughout her military career. She'd learned that being underestimated could be an advantage, that careful preparation was never wasted effort, and that sometimes the most important thing a soldier could do was trust their own judgment even when everyone else disagreed. The 20 enemy fighters eliminated during that long night had represented more than just tactical victories. They'd been proof that individual excellence, applied at the right moment with the right skills, could change the outcome of engagements that seemed hopeless. Maya's story would become part of military legend, but more importantly, it would demonstrate that heroes aren't always the loudest voices in the room sometimes. They're the quiet ones who see what others miss and act when others hesitate. The Division Intelligence Headquarters at Bagram Airfield was a world away from the forward operating base Maya had left behind. Clean corridors lined with secure briefing rooms, banks of computer terminals displaying real-time intelligence feeds, and officers who spoke in the measured tones of professional analysts rather than the sharp commands of combat leaders. Maya's new workspace included advanced surveillance equipment, satellite imagery systems, and databases containing years of accumulated intelligence on regional threats. But despite the technological sophistication of her new environment, Maya found herself returning to the same methodical approach that had served her so well in the field. While her colleagues relied heavily on electronic intercepts and drone footage, she continued to study patterns in human behavior, looking for the subtle indicators that preceded enemy action. Her first major assignment came within 2 weeks of her arrival. Intelligence had detected increased communications activity in the mountainous region near the Pakistani border, and conventional analysis suggested a possible arms trafficking operation. The assessment was based on standard metrics, communication frequency, movement patterns detected by satellite, and intercepts of coded transmissions. Maya reviewed the electronic intelligence carefully, but she also requested access to human intelligence reports from the region. What she found troubled her. Local sources were reporting changes in behavior among village populations, subtle shifts that suggested preparation for some kind of significant event. Markets were closing earlier than usual. Families were sending children to relatives in distant areas, and traditional gathering places were being avoided. The pattern reminded Maya of the behavioral changes she'd observed before the assault on her previous base. Civilian populations often had advance warning of military operations, either through direct threats or indirect indicators that suggested impending violence. But these warnings were rarely included in formal intelligence assessments because they were difficult to quantify and verify. Maya spent 3 days correlating the electronic intelligence with human source reports, building a comprehensive picture of activity in the target region. What emerged was more concerning than a simple arms trafficking operation. The communications, patterns, movement indicators, and civilian behavior changes suggested preparation for a major offensive operation against coalition forces. Her analysis identified 3 potential targets for attack: a supply convoy route used regularly by American forces, a helicopter landing zone that served as a logistics hub for regional operations, and a small outpost that monitored border crossings. Each target had strategic value, and a coordinated assault against all 3 would significantly disrupt coalition operations in the region. Maya prepared a detailed intelligence brief outlining her assessment and recommendations. The analysis was thorough, documented with multiple source citations, and presented with the same methodical precision that had characterized her work at the forward base. But this time, she was presenting to officers who understood the value of comprehensive intelligence analysis. Colonel Williams, the division intelligence chief, reviewed Maya's brief with obvious interest. Unlike Captain Rodriguez, Williams had built his career on the principle that good intelligence came from multiple sources and careful analysis rather than technological superiority alone. He'd specifically requested Maya's assignment because of her demonstrated ability to see patterns that others missed. "Sergeant Chen, your assessment suggests we're looking at a coordinated operation rather than isolated criminal activity. Williams said after studying her analysis. "What's your confidence level in this evaluation?" Maya had learned to present her assessments with appropriate professional caution, but she also knew the importance of clear communication when lives were at stake. "Sir, the pattern indicators are consistent with pre-operational activity for a major assault." The civilian displacement patterns particularly concern me, as they suggest local populations have received warnings about impending violence. Williams nodded, apparently appreciating her directness. "Your recommendations for protective measures?" "Sir, I recommend enhanced security for all 3 potential targets, with particular attention to the supply convoy route. The communication intercept suggests coordination between multiple enemy groups, which would allow for simultaneous attacks designed to overwhelm response capabilities." The colonel studied the tactical maps that accompanied Maya's analysis, noting the geographic relationships between the potential targets and the indicators of enemy activity. Her assessment painted a picture of a sophisticated operation planned by competent leadership with access to detailed intelligence about coalition activities. "Chen, I'm forwarding your analysis to operational commanders with a recommendation for immediate protective measures," Williams said. "I want you to continue monitoring the situation and provide updates as new intelligence becomes available." Over the following week, Maya tracked developments in the target region with growing concern. The behavioral patterns that had initially suggested preparation for offensive action were intensifying. More families were leaving the area, local markets were operating on restricted schedules, and traditional social activities had been suspended. The civilian population was clearly preparing for significant violence. Electronic intelligence continued to show increased communications activity, but the specific content of the transmissions remained difficult to interpret. The enemy groups were using code words and references that didn't match standard intelligence databases, suggesting either new operational procedures or leadership that hadn't been previously identified. Maya's concern deepened when human source reports began describing the arrival of foreign fighters in the region. These weren't local insurgents or tribal militants, but apparently trained soldiers from outside the immediate area. Their presence suggested that the planned operation had attracted external support and professional military expertise. On the 8th day of her monitoring, Maya's analysis was validated in the most dramatic way possible. 3 coordinated attacks struck coalition forces within a span of 2 hours, targeting exactly the locations she'd identified in her intelligence brief. The supply convoy route was hit by a sophisticated ambush, involving improvised explosive devices and coordinated small arms fire. The helicopter landing zone came under mortar attack just as a logistics flight was preparing to land. The border outpost faced a ground assault by approximately 40 fighters using military tactics and equipment. The attacks were repelled successfully because operational commanders had implemented Maya's recommended protective measures. Additional security personnel had been assigned to each location. Patrol schedules had been modified to include the recommended routes, and reaction forces had been positioned to respond quickly to threats in the target areas. But Maya felt no satisfaction in being proven correct. 3 coalition soldiers had been wounded in the attacks, and significant equipment had been damaged. Despite the defensive preparations, the enemy operation had been sophisticated and well coordinated, suggesting capabilities that conventional intelligence assessment had failed to identify. Colonel Williams called Maya to his office immediately after the attacks were reported. His expression showed a mixture of relief and concern. Relief that her warnings had prevented worse casualties, concern about the implications of her analytical accuracy. "Chen, your intelligence assessment was precisely correct about the timing, targets, and nature of enemy operations," Williams said without preamble. "That level of analytical accuracy is exceptional under any circumstances." Maya had prepared for this conversation, knowing that her success would raise questions about intelligence collection and analysis procedures. "Sir, the indicators were clear once all available information was synthesized. The challenge was recognizing that electronic intelligence needed to be supplemented with human source reporting about civilian behavior patterns. Williams leaned forward, clearly interested in her analytical methodology. Explain your approach to pattern recognition. How do you identify significant indicators among the background noise of routine intelligence collection? Maya had been asked this question before, usually by officers who wanted to understand whether her methods could be systematized and taught to other analysts. The honest answer was that pattern recognition required a combination of training, experience, and intuitive understanding that was difficult to transfer directly. "Sir, I look for changes in baseline behavior rather than isolated events," she explained. Enemy operations require preparation that involves multiple groups and activities. Those preparations create patterns that are visible if you know what to look for and how to correlate different types of intelligence. The colonel nodded, apparently satisfied with her explanation. "Chen, I'm assigning you to lead a new analytical team focused on tactical pattern recognition. Your job will be to identify emerging threats using the same methodology that predicted this week's attacks." The assignment represented everything Maya had hoped for during her military career: recognition for her analytical abilities, authority to implement her methodological approach, and responsibility for protecting coalition forces through superior intelligence work. But it also carried the weight of knowing that her assessments could mean the difference between life and death for soldiers in the field. Maya's new team consisted of 6 junior analysts with diverse backgrounds in intelligence collection and assessment. Some had experience with electronic intercepts, others specialized in human source reporting, and several had backgrounds in geographic and demographic analysis. Maya's job was to teach them to synthesize these different types of information into comprehensive threat assessments. The first lesson she taught was the importance of understanding baseline conditions before trying to identify changes that might indicate emerging threats. This required studying normal patterns of behavior in target regions, how people moved, communicated, and conducted their daily activities when no military operations were planned. Effective threat detection depends on recognizing when normal patterns change, Maya explained during their first training session. Enemy operations require coordination and preparation that disrupts routine activities. If you understand what normal looks like, you can identify when something significant is developing. Her team began implementing this approach immediately, establishing baseline assessments for multiple regions where coalition forces operated. The work was methodical and time-consuming, requiring careful analysis of routine intelligence reports to identify normal patterns of activity. But Maya knew that this foundation was essential for accurate threat detection. Within a month, Maya's team had identified 3 emerging threat situations that conventional analysis had missed. In each case, the indicators were subtle changes in communication patterns, modifications to routine movement schedules, and civilian behavioral shifts that suggested advanced knowledge of planned operations. The first threat was an improvised explosive device network operating along a major supply route. Maya's team identified the threat by noting changes in local traffic patterns and communication activity that suggested coordination between previously unconnected groups. Protective measures were implemented before the devices could be employed, and subsequent investigation confirmed the accuracy of their assessment. The second threat involved a planned rocket attack against a coalition air base. The team's analysis identified supply movements and personnel positioning that indicated preparation for indirect fire operations. The threat was neutralized through preemptive action based on Maya's intelligence assessment, preventing an attack that could have caused significant casualties and damage. The third threat was a kidnapping operation targeting coalition personnel. During routine patrols, Maya's team recognized the threat through analysis of surveillance activities and changes in civilian Behavior near popular patrol routes. The warning allowed patrol schedules to be modified and additional security measures to be implemented, effectively deterring the planned operation. Each successful threat identification enhanced Maya's reputation within the intelligence community and validated her analytical methodology. But more importantly, each success meant that coalition soldiers went home safely, rather than becoming casualties of enemy operations that could have been prevented with better intelligence work. Maya's approach began attracting attention from higher levels of military leadership. General Morrison, the regional commander responsible for all coalition operations in eastern Afghanistan, requested a briefing on her analytical methods and their potential application to broader strategic intelligence challenges. The briefing took place in a secure conference room at regional headquarters, with an audience that included senior officers from multiple military branches and intelligence agencies. Maya presented her methodology with the same careful precision. She brought to operational intelligence analysis, explaining how pattern recognition could supplement traditional intelligence collection techniques. The key insight is that enemy operations require coordination between multiple groups and activities. Maya explained to the assembled officers that coordination creates detectable patterns if you know how to correlate different types of intelligence and understand what baseline conditions look like. General Morrison asked the question that Maya had expected. Sergeant Chen, can this methodology be systematized and implemented throughout our intelligence operations, or does it depend on individual analytical capabilities that can't be easily transferred? Maya had considered this question carefully, knowing that the military's preference was for standardized procedures that could be applied consistently across different units and theaters of operation. Sir, the basic principles can be taught and systematized. The challenge is developing the experiential knowledge needed to recognize subtle pattern changes and understand their significance. The general nodded, apparently appreciating her honest assessment. Chen, I'm directing that your analytical approach be incorporated into standard intelligence training curriculum. I also want you to establish pattern recognition teams at each major command level, using your current team as the model. The directive represented vindication on a scale Maya had never imagined possible. Her analytical methods, which had been dismissed as overthinking and paranoia just months earlier, were now being adopted as standard procedure throughout the regional command structure. The quiet observation skills that had made her seem unreliable were being recognized as exactly the capabilities the military needed to stay ahead of adaptive enemy threats. But Maya understood that institutional recognition was only meaningful if it translated into better protection for soldiers in the field. Over the following months, she worked to establish pattern recognition teams at 6 different command levels, training analysts to implement her methodology while adapting it to local conditions and threat environments. The results were consistently positive. Threat detection rates improved significantly wherever the new analytical approach was implemented, leading to better force protection and more effective operational planning. Enemy operations that might have achieved surprise were anticipated and countered before they could develop into serious threats. Maya's transformation from dismissed analyst to recognized expert was complete, but she never forgot the lessons learned during her marginalization. The most important skills weren't always the most obvious ones, and the most valuable insights often came from perspectives that seemed unconventional or unreliable to conventional thinking. Years later, as Maya progressed through increasingly senior positions in military intelligence, she made sure to listen carefully to junior analysts whose observations didn't fit standard patterns. She remembered what it felt like to see threats that others couldn't recognize, and to have those warnings dismissed as paranoia or overthinking. The 20 enemy fighters eliminated during that night at the forward base had represented more than tactical victories. They'd been proof that individual preparation, analytical precision, and the courage to act when others hesitate could change the outcome of much larger conflicts. Maya carried those lessons throughout her career, applying them to increasingly complex intelligence challenges, while never forgetting that sometimes the most important battles are won by people who simply refuse to accept that their expertise doesn't matter. Her story became part of military training curriculum, used to illustrate the importance of comprehensive intelligence analysis and the value of diverse analytical perspectives. But Maya knew the real lesson was simpler. Preparation is never wasted. Patterns matter more than technology. And sometimes the person everyone dismisses as a liability is actually the one who saves everyone else when the systems fail and the lights go out. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.